everybody, and welcome to Taking Control, the ADHD podcast on rashpixel.fm. I'm Nikki Kinzer, and today is a very special episode. But before I tell you what it is, please head over to takecontroladhd.com and get to know us a little bit better. You can listen to the show right there on the website or subscribe to our mailing list and get an email with the latest episode each week. Connect with us on Twitter or Facebook at Take Control ADHD. And if this show has ever touched you or helped you make a change in your life for the better, we invite you to consider supporting the show directly through Patreon. With a few dollars a month, you can help guarantee that we continue to grow the show, add new features, and invest more heavily in our community. Visit patreon.com/the ADHD podcast to learn more. Hey, I think I did okay.
You should do it all the time.
That was really great. You should really do it all the time.
That's right. Awesome. Well, it is a special episode today, and I have two very special guests today. I am interviewing the co-hosts of What's That Smell podcast. Yay! Applause. So this is a sometimes funny podcast, but I have to say that the shows that I've listened to are pretty darn funny, about humans and their anxieties, which aren't always so funny. They're kind of weird sometimes. Every week, these hosts each drag one of their deepest, darkest anxieties into the light to share it, to learn about it, and hopefully laugh about it with all of you. So those guests, those hosts, our guests on our show, and the host of What's That Smell is our very own Pete Wright. Welcome, Pete.
Well, thanks, Nikki. It's really great to be here.
Welcome to the ADHD
I feel like
podcast.
I should have worn a different hat. Maybe that would do it.
That's right. And his co-host, Tommy Metz the Third. Hi, Tommy.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. I'm very excited to be interviewing both of you. Before we get started, make sure you listen to the very end of this episode because Pete and Tommy have given us a segment of their show to play for you. I want you to get a sense of their show and how they help us all to laugh at the sorts of anxieties that can really get the better of us if we're not careful. Plus, this is a sneak preview. The episode isn't scheduled to release until later in May. So last week, this is where the idea came. We had a show about being optimistic. And Pete actually brought up What's That Smell podcast a couple of different times in different areas around the topic and talking about how optimism can help ease some of our anxieties. And I have anxiety myself, so I'm also in your club. Yes. And I know that many of our listeners do too. So I thought this would be a great time to have you two on our show to talk about your show. What do you guys think? You ready for this?
Well, it gives me a great deal of anxiety, frankly.
Right?
I'm not, I think the answer is categorically no, I'm not ready for this, but I'm excited to do it anyway. I'm really excited that Tommy's here because I could not do it alone.
No.
I also feel like you both are better lit than me. So so I'm already like not at a 10, but that's okay.
Oh, you're
I just have this one creepy light from the top that's making me look like the Crypt Keeper, but that's cool.
Oh, it's Kaiser Soze. Yeah. That's right.
Fantastic. All right. Well, before we get started, I want to tell our audience who you are. And Pete, our audience knows who you are, but maybe there's, something in addition that you would like to add to our audience that maybe they don't know about you and this other podcast that you do.
Yikes. Okay. Yes, I do other podcasts and I do What's That Smell, the sometimes funny podcast about humans and their anxieties. Been doing that now. We're about to wrap up our third season, which is very exciting. And for those who don't know, I also do the Next Reel Film podcast, and Tommy is a regular contributor on that as well because of his deep insider connections to the entertainment industry, which I can't wait for him to talk about. So through rashpixel.fm, I run a number of other podcasts, and everybody knows that, this is my favorite one, is the ADHD podcast. Everything else is just slightly subservient to that.
How does Tommy feel about that?
I don't care for it.
I bet you don't.
I don't like it very much at all.
No.
He says the same thing on every episode of ours, so it's okay.
I'm sure.
Slightly subservient every show.
Well, Tommy, tell the audience a little bit about who you are.
I live in Los Angeles with my dog, Foster. I am a filmmaker. I'm a writer-director. I moved out to Los Angeles in '98, and I've been making short films, and I just made my first feature I guess, last year. And that's it.
How do you guys know each other?
Oh, I made a really loud noise. That means I should say something.
You did. That was the
you need
entree.
to talk. Yeah.
We were in
a
a acapella group, ladies. We were in an acapella group in college at CU Boulder called In the Buff because of the CU Buffaloes, and acapella loves wordplay.
Right. Okay. I did not realize that was the connection. So at the end of this podcast, are you guys going to like sing?
Absolutely.
Always, and every chance we get. But I did post a while back. The group is still going on, and so the current members actually finally got around to posting the entire In the Buff CD catalog into all of the digital streaming services, so you can actually go find it and you can hear Tommy's sweet tones.
Nice.
He's amazing. And your songs were, Tom?
Southern Cross and Windmills, and then a bunch of just nonsense.
So show up for Windmills, but stick around for the nonsense.
Right. That's right. Yeah. All right. Okay. So I'm going to go back to What's That Smell? This
all right.
podcast. Tell us a little bit about it. How would you describe it?
Who doesn't have anxiety? And I live with anxiety in addition to ADHD and struggle with predominantly just sort of generalized anxiety and social anxiety, and really is sort of a potpourri of the specialized anxieties that we talk about every week. And I was sitting in a conference some years back, and I heard I was a live show of another podcast that I love very, very much, and they told this story. The specific story was they were taking a question from an audience member or a listener that said, who worked in a wedding shop, like fittings for tuxedos and dresses and things. And occasionally customers would come in and they would smell really good. How do you tell someone who smells good that they smell good when you're like a proprietor at a shop and without it looking really weird?
Creepy.
Like, how do you do that?
Right.
And the final like laugh line, and they came up with their general advice was, you can't, please don't open your mouth. It's going to be weird no matter what you do.
You're smelling good.
And the final like laugh line on that was that you just stand next to them as you're staring in the window and you just go, what's that smell? And I thought, oh my God, that is exactly my experience. That's still weird. It's horrible. And I think I immediately thought about this podcast, and there is no one else that I would rather talk about anxiety with than Tommy.
Oh, wait. I don't know if that's sort of a mixed bag thing.
Yeah. Well, because actually one of our listeners, Tommy, has a specific question for you, because they say that Pete has explained where the idea for the podcast came from, but it's never been very clear why Tommy wanted to do What's That Smell? What made you want to explore the world of all things? Yikes, she says.
It's still not clear why Tommy said yes to this project.
I'm a really big fan of the email address. No, that's for long-time listeners. Good stuff. First and foremost, it was absolutely a chance to work with Pete. Pete and I, ever since college, we just knew that we were sort of kindred spirits in a lot of different ways and have always been looking for more and more ways to work together. So when he asked, he sort of said, I have a podcast idea for both of us. And if I didn't say it out loud in my head, I said, okay. And then he explained what it was. I don't know how much. Did you know that I really truck in anxiety, Pete? I can't remember. Leading up to this, or was it just you did? We've talked.
Yeah,
I don't remember.
Yeah, we've talked about that.
Okay, yeah.
Right.
So then it was a perfect fit because over the last few years, I've really been trying to be more open about my anxiety. I kept it a secret for a very long time, and that really compounds it. And so I was talking to people about, I mean, hopefully not incessantly, but like that I am going to therapy, that I was on medication, just demystifying it and getting it out there. And what a great way to do it is to do this sort of thing, because one of the biggest points that the podcast tries to put forward is that you're not alone. And one of the ways to know you're not alone is to talk about it and to share in the community. So I don't remember the original question.
You got it.
How long have I been talking?
You're good. You're good.
Okay, good.
So the podcast, obviously, you guys do a lot of research because it's very clear. You'll talk about a particular anxiety. You're doing the research. Do you also offer strategies and ideas on how to deal with the particular anxiety, or I mean, I know that talking about it and making sure people don't feel alone is a big part of that. But anything in addition that you actually, because we're a very how-to show, right, Pete? Like, we definitely talk about a lot of strategies. I'm just curious where you guys fall on that.
Well, it's a fine line because neither Tommy and I are experts in anxiety insofar as we have it, right? And we don't have all of it. We have some of it, and so we're really
working
hard
on having all of it.
We're working on it. It's a collection that you build over years.
Yeah.
And so we talk a lot about our experiences, but we really do try to offer some strategies for how you might consider thinking about different things. And there's one that is a great example for me that was one of our listener submissions that neither Tommy nor I have, and we just recorded the show on it. It's coming out late in season 3, which is a listener who wrote in saying, I'm retiring on Friday and I'm terrified of it. Tommy and I are not retiring soon, but also we kind of live a life of as if we've already retired, so it's glorious. We're pretty carefree. But it's that idea is to just dive into discussion boards and dive into research and other therapeutic resources that have talked about it, and just try to present a landscape of information that might help a listener going through this to actually deal with it and to maybe pivot the way they think about it to try to come to terms with it. So because it's terrifying, and that is, I think, and Tommy, I don't want to speak for you, but that's, I think, one of the things that we've gotten better at over the last 3 seasons is putting ourselves in the sort of frame of somebody living with a specific anxiety, even if it's not one that we have, and trying to present a way forward just based on our love of laughing about our own anxieties.
Well, that's one of the things that I really enjoy about the show, because I think that when you start talking about anxiety or things that you fear, it can easily take people into a dark place, right? It could easily take you there. But you guys don't do that. Every single episode I've listened to, I smile out loud. I laugh out loud. It's very entertaining along as being really informational. I have to ask, how do you do that? How do you take some of these like dark issues and make them feel lighter?
I think there is room to always laugh about everything. That a lot of the worries that we have or anxiety that we have is actually not necessary. It's just sort of these prisons that we're putting ourselves in. So it kind of feels like that's our job, because we don't want to just revel in it. But there's always something. I mean, thanks, Internet. There's always a way to find something weird or interesting about everything. And even when it does get really dark, like Pete's Buried Alive episode, which I often reference as the least listened to episode, because I know a lot of people were like, great, I loved the first half, then click, because there was no way for us to make that, it was just too foreboding of a topic. Yeah.
Right. So there was a question from the listeners about the research that you guys do. So how do you go about finding your research? Do you just Google it, or do you have like an actual like go-to anxiety, informational place that you find this information?
Have you heard of Bing?
Bing, kind of like Google.
You go to Bing and then you type in google.com, and then
there you go.
We don't actually talk about it because, part of the premise of the show is that we surprise each other each week. Like we don't know what the other person is bringing to the table that week. And we have run into scenarios in the past where, we've sort of collided, and we tried to kind of share one topic over both halves of the episode, and it just did not work, and took hours to just re-record the entire episode because it was just just didn't fly. I have this set of resources, the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, Health and Human Services, to look for research to sort of act as a foundational kind of element for what I bring to the show. And so there's a set of kind of base, research-oriented organizations and associations that do that. But specific phobias is a major category of the stuff that we get questions on, right? And specific phobias are kind of hard sometimes to nail down because there's no like one master list. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual actually only says, here are the big 5 kind of categories of specific phobias, and therapists are just kind of run into them, occasionally, and might have to make up words for them. And so we end up with these funny terms that are kind of fun to talk about. So it's hard to do research on some of the things that we run into. And so we just kind of do our best. But
so I just want to be clear, because that was one of the questions that came up, kind of the behind the scenes prep. So you two each come up with your own phobia or your own kind of anxiety. And you guys, you have no idea what the other person's going to talk about, and you just start talking.
Yes, and that was what now we're doing one of us does a personal and the other does a listener submission because we've been getting enough of those. But yeah, that was always the idea that Pete pitched, and I loved it because I think that's what makes it sound like a conversation. It's actually a conversation. There's a lot of podcasts out there already where they're like, "That's a good point, Karen," and you're like, "They're not." This is all written out.
Karen didn't make a good point.
Yeah.
And John also doesn't think that was a great point.
Exactly. And so, the fact that we're honestly interested and engaged because we have no idea wherever things are going.
Yes.
Well, and Tommy, that's one of the things I just that made it such a natural fit. I think for Tommy, he's such an exceptional improviser compared to me that being reactive and responsive to those kinds of conversations and being a generous kind of comedy writer himself makes it just kind of easy to have those conversations and make them feel natural and authentic. We go a long way to try to make them sound authentic, and he's mugging the camera now. And it's really hard to take.
I just hit the microphone.
See, that's what I enjoy. I think that's why I laugh so hard when I'm listening to you two. And Tommy, it's these little, like, you don't even say much, but it's just the way you comment is hilarious. Like, just
you
even
hear
at
that,
the
Tom?
beginning.
You don't say much.
Yeah, well, no, it's just like, I don't like that. Like, it's just so plain. It's like, nope, I don't like it.
Yeah.
That doesn't work for me. I remember you saying that at one of those things, at one of the episodes too. That just doesn't work for me.
We can just shorten it to
subtle.
nope. Yes.
That's great. So, okay, now you're getting listener feedback, right? So now you're splitting the show, or it's one of your anxieties and then somebody else from the listener. So has there ever been a submission that you have gotten that you're like, we just can't talk about this? Like, this is just so off limits that we can't do it. This is from a listener. This is a listener question from our show.
So off limits, we can't do it. I don't know. Tom, have we had one of those?
From a listener submission?
Yeah.
No, because they're allowed to be as anonymous as they want to be.
Yeah.
And we've used some fake names. We've just used anonymous. So I think that frees up a lot of that.
People are getting better, I think, at coming up with better fake anonymous profiles when they write us. They set us up pretty easily now. Right. It used to be just don't use my name. Now it's you can call me Bilbo of the Shire.
That guy's a mess. Yeah, I don't think so. There are some that are still in the waiting pile only because we haven't found like an angle on it. Pete gets them all at the world's worst email address and then just separates them unread and gives some to me. And I have some that I feel like I need some sort of a take, or do I have a connection to it? And until I do, I don't want to force it. But I know that's not exactly undoable. I don't think I've had one where it's like, oh, can't touch that. I have those for myself. Mm-hmm. I have a couple anxieties in my own life that I'm not comfortable sharing. Of course, because I'm not a sociopath. I think everyone would be like that. So that's as far as I can go with that.
There are some that where like, for example, the one where Tom ran into roadkill, immediately thought about eating it, and then threw up on the street. That may have been an example of one where he should have probably not talked about it.
Right.
That's the thing is I go too far the other way. I actually just went to lunch with a friend who listens to the show, and he asked, so do you ever worry about putting this kind of stuff out there about yourself? And I went, well, and I realized that it never occurred to me to be
worry about it. You've just added another anxiety to my life. Thanks.
Yeah. And then like I incessantly talk about how I don't trust technology. I don't trust the internet. I don't trust anything. And yet I'm on here being like, you ever looked at a squirrel and puked? So I've got a real unfirm grasp about repercussions and all that.
So question for both of you guys. You have talked about a lot of anxieties. Do you feel like your anxiety level has decreased or increased by doing the show?
We've had some listeners tell us, like, write in and say thanks for the new anxiety.
Right. Yeah.
That's true.
That's the collateral damage that comes with our podcast.
Yeah.
And the easiest one for me to talk about it now is some of my health and heart issues, because that is a repeat refrain on this show. And I feel like I had done some of the primer work in past seasons, just bringing it out there, talking about here are the things I'm anxious about. And then my dad had to go in for this bypass surgery some weeks ago, and that was a traumatic sort of like, I'm going to stand and stare in the face of all of my medical anxieties at once. And it was grim, I mean, it's a grim experience to have to do that. But honestly, I feel like the experience of talking about it on the show and then using the show as a platform to talk about that experience of having lived through it was enormously helpful for me. And it was just a lucky chance to define the purpose of what's that smell for me personally. Like it was a great opportunity to do that. Occasionally I'll run into this where Tommy will bring an anxiety that is important to him. And it's as if over the years of my life, I will have forgotten that I was once anxious about that. And then I can't stop thinking about it. Then the sort of obsessive compulsive like thought spiral will spring up. And now, oh yeah, right, I forgot. It's like old home week for anxiety,
It's always fun because we can't see each other when we're recording. We can just hear each other. And I'll be like, so this is a weird one. Lakes. Have you ever been afraid? And you hear Pete go, and I'm like, oh, I think we hit on something. He's got this pre-talking shiver that I'm like, okay, he's going to be able to relate.
When we got a boat last year, and I remember talking to Pete about our boat, and we were going to go out on the lake, and he's like, no, that doesn't sound like fun at all.
Not even a little tiny bit.
He's like, no, not for me. That's great. So, okay. A question from a listener. How many anxieties have you explored on the show that developed into legitimate anxieties for you that you didn't have before? So it's kind of playing off of what you just said. Do you think it happens more often than not, or you can listen to Tommy's anxiety and be like, well, that doesn't bug me?
Yeah. For me, it's I either already lived with it and like it's hand to glove, or I don't deal with it. Mm-hmm. I don't think I've ever had an anxiety on the show that has caused me to go into that obsessive thought spiral mode after we've finished the show.
So you're not thinking about it at night?
Yeah, not a new thing.
Not a new thing.
I don't know. Tommy, am I lying?
I don't know what you do at night, Pete. But as far as me, no, because even if that were to sort of start to happen, for me, the podcast itself sort of exorcises that, because we already brought it out into the light and laughed about it and talked about it and acknowledged that we're not alone. And so it's already sort of done a lot of the work. My anxiety likes to live in the dark and to try to keep me in the dark with it. When I have a really bad anxiety, the very first thing that it always does, I personalize it. I know I shouldn't do that, but that it does is try to tell me, don't reach out for help. Because you're a weirdo and people are going to judge you and not like you. And so just stay here and figure it out under the covers. And that's not going to work at all. I don't have covers. So just the idea of talking it through really helps for me.
Well, and I can imagine people listening to you, it helps them too. Because like you said at the very beginning, it's about not feeling alone and understanding that these thoughts happen. These things are real. And I think that's a great service in itself. So tell me, what lessons have you guys learned over these last several months? You started the podcast in February of 2018, I think I read or saw.
Yeah, that sounds
right.
That sounds right.
And you do seasons, right? How many episodes are in each season?
We do 12 episode seasons.
Okay. So that's
we're just wrapping our third season.
Quite a few.
Wrapping recording this season.
Wrapping recording. That's
all right. So yeah, what have you guys learned?
I think for a lot of my life, I took anxiety too seriously. Anxiety is serious. And we're never trying to say anxiety is stupid, so get over yourself. Quite the opposite. We're saying anxiety has a ton of power over you, but it shouldn't. And one of the ways that you can release that hold or release its strength is drag it out to the light. How many times have I said drag it out to the light? That is so hardwired in my brain. But is just to not hide it and just to come out and say, you're not alone and we have this. And isn't this kind of silly? And then usually find like some person that has gone like way too far. You know, if we have any kind of anecdotes we can find, any of that. That's just such a good reminder for me.
Yeah, I echo that certainly. And it's sort of a parallel path to the ADHD experience, right? That things started getting better once I acknowledged it. Right, to myself, that this is a thing that's real. I've had other people external to my own brain tell me this is a thing that's real for you, and you need to live with this thing and figure out, what those accommodations are going to look like. And that ADHD experience was transformative, and now it's been almost 20 years, and I'm a different person, categorically a different person. And so the act for me of going through this with Tommy and putting the words to the things that I fear, putting the categories of anxiety to the like home base where I live, and being able to talk more authentically about particularly the social anxiety, the giving myself permission to explore that has been, that's been huge in my day to day. And so, this podcast is very much a conduit for, figuring out what 8 a.m. Monday morning is going to look like. And so that's big. And then, we use the off season because we start producing the show a couple months before the season goes live. And so, we'll wrap recording, then we have another month or so of production to do. And so we only get kind of a 3 or 4 month break from each other. And then we're back on it again. And that 3 or 4 months is like, it's like runway, it's like you're trying to test some of the things, some of the ways of thinking that at least for me, that I've learned, over the last season. And, how am I going to approach health stuff? How am I going to approach, aphasia? How am I going to approach all these things that live in my head, constantly and give them less power?
So what inspires you to keep doing this?
Well, I think it's that we haven't run out of anxieties yet.
Oh, what happens when you do? That's a good point. What happens if you do?
I mean, one of the reasons that we did start doing, I believe, Pete, listener submissions is to give ourselves more time. I mean, at some point, we're going to be like, that cup kind of makes me nervous. I mean, we're going to be sort of grasping at straws. And we made a promise to each other not to force it.
Yeah,
like if we're just out or if we don't have something, we just don't have something. The listener submissions are really helping with that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And the other piece was that we had this conversation after season 1 and started feeling that meta anxiety about this is a thing that's very public and it's out there. And we have just given the world each 12 anxieties that we live with about ourselves. Now they know something about us. And that is a weird kind of power differential, right? And there's part of us, we kind of said collectively, maybe we want to slow it down a little bit, right? And so starting to take listener submissions was a great way to kind of help us ease the load. And it really helps ease the load when people are willing to kind of be vulnerable and give us fodder for something else to talk about. And sometimes it's very serious. Sometimes I don't know, we've dealt with the kind of the spectrum of anxieties. So,
well, I'm curious about that. Share with the audience some of the anxieties anxieties that you guys have covered?
Oh,
Tom, do you have your top 5 list of favorite anxieties?
That just sounds weird, but
Yeah.
go ahead, Tommy.
Let's see. What have we talked about? We've talked about bureaucracy, being buried alive, health problems, not knowing what to wear. All the food is killing you.
Yeah, food is killing. That was a favorite. We've talked about issues around social anxiety, but around sexuality and gender roles, and coming to terms with what those things, what those concepts are, and how do you act as an ally? How do you kind of help reduce fear in those kinds of relationships?
When your boss takes you out to dinner, do you have to help split the check?
Yeah, we did. Yeah, we totally did that, and that was hard.
So what was the outcome? What was the decision? Do you or don't you?
Don't go out to dinner with your boss.
Just ever?
Yeah.
Ever.
At the end of every episode, we just say, remember, don't leave your apartment. That's always the big, no, the answer to that one was, be in a situation where, it was what should you order? Not what should you help pay? What should you order? Mm-hmm. Order after your boss. And if your boss gets a side and a drink and a thing, then those are all free game. If not, if you can't do that, go ahead and order what you want, but then offer to pay for dessert at the end, because they will almost never take it because the boss wants to be the one, but then you get credit for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So what about being afraid of the dark? Because we had a listener, right, from our show that called in about being afraid of the dark. How did you guys deal with that one? Pete, I'm specifically interested in about what you did with your hamper. Tell the ADHDers out there what Pete did as a young child.
Now, look, I feel hijacked right now. This was a delightful listener submission, and it was a very young listener, the child of one of our ADHD listeners, and
so cute.
So cute. Sent us an audio submission and about being afraid of the dark and afraid of the fire alarm at school, because you never know when it's going to go off. And so we sort of locked in on the dark thing. And in the process of thinking about this and researching it, I was reintroduced to a story of my own youth where I would do some weird, I don't know, sleep walking, whatever. First, you go in and you take a big stick and you beat your closet before you go to bed. Always beat the closet, your clothes first. Just beat them up. And then my thing was, it gets rid of the monsters. At least it ensures you that you're not there. And then my thing is that I deliriously got up in the middle of the night and I walked into my closet and I looked at the clothes hamper and then I peed on it. And
that's great.
That was not now, everybody. That was not now.
That was 2 weeks ago.
It was. Let's see. When did this air? Yeah, right. So
ancient history.
It's funny. That's one of the things about this show, just how resonant these stories of our childhood become when they meet you headlong in the present.
That's something that I've learned very much from the podcast. I'm going to go ahead and say is just how natural it is and unfortunate it is that things that you were afraid of way, way back in the day, like in childhood, some of those really stick around. And you let them stick around because you're just sort of used to them. That's what I'm trying to work on, is identifying certain things as that is an old feeling. You had a purpose back then. You don't anymore. Goodbye. That doesn't work necessarily. That's just me walking around the streets saying goodbye to my old anxieties. Weird. Drag it into the light. You're under arrest. But yeah, that they always, therapists and stuff always say, tell me about your childhood. It's true. I mean, yeah.
All right, you guys. Well, so if somebody from our podcast would like to listen to your podcast and maybe even submit their own anxiety for you guys to talk about, how would they do that?
I'm not saying it.
Tom, do you want to do it?
I don't want to do it.
Really?
You do it.
You should. You should probably do it. Okay. So there are lots of ways to get to reach us. You can find us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page. We have there's Twitter. The thing about me and Tom collectively is that we're terrible at social media, genuinely terrible. And so we don't post a lot. We have some things that just sort of auto post when a show goes live, but we're not very good at interacting on it. And that's related probably to anxiety. So
Could be. Sure.
we should lock that down. Write that down. But you can also email us, just plain old email, at somethingstinky@whatsthatsmell.net. somethingstinky@whatsthatsmell.net.
Yeah. Okay. I don't think you're going to forget that.
That was a choice that was made.
Look, it was the lightest weight joke that I could possibly come up with, something stinky at whatsthatsmell.net. This was before I had no idea that it would be such a trigger for Tom. And insofar as we tend to be fairly generous and gracious with one another, I can't do that on this. Like, we are owning that email because this is nonsense, man.
I think there has not been an episode where I have not accidentally done some vocal tick of displeasure
Of that email.
about that one choice that Pete made of the 900 things he does. I just sit here like this, cover up my dog behind me. I do nothing for the show except my anxiety, and then we have to get on the computer half an hour before we record because Pete has to remind me how my computer works and how everything works. And then he does one thing without me, and I go, no! But I don't care because I just hate it so much. I'm so sorry. But I think you're right. Because that's so unfair of me, we have to keep it.
Right.
Oh,
yeah.
I must be, it's like self-flagellation.
You must be put in your place.
Exactly.
It's a podcast marriage. Somebody has to compromise. And it looks like it's you, Tommy.
Yeah,
That's right.
I always go to bed angry.
That's right. Well, thank you both so much for being here. I appreciate it. I'm sure our listeners appreciate it. I don't have an ending because I'm so used to you doing it, Pete, that I forgot to actually add an ending to this podcast. So I think you need to do it anyway. Even though
you got it. I can take us out for sure.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody, for downloading and listening to this podcast about that other podcast. We sure appreciate your time and your attention. On behalf of Nikki Kinzer and Tommy Metz III, I'm Pete Wright. We'll catch you next time right here on Taking Control, the ADHD podcast.
Pete, I have a red hot and shiny new listener submission this week. And I think it's going to be very relatable because it happens all the time. Are you ready?
Oh, I'm very excited.
All right. This comes to us from Anonymous. Quote, my anxiety is embarrassingly simple. It's being asked, quote, how are things? And the variations on, how are you? What's new? Any good news? Especially among friends or acquaintances I only see or talk to occasionally. A Christmas party is a nightmare of anticipation. Write that down as another possible title for this podcast. Nightmare of anticipation. Sorry. I feel like if I don't have a great accomplishment, victory, or something positive to brag about, it's always disappointing. Of course, even more so on days things aren't going well. Trying to blow off the question, I will often answer with a jokey, living the dream, good, or nothing exciting. I am continually amazed how few people take the cue. Most just follow up with more specific questions. Dating anyone? Any acting jobs? Etc., making it worse. I have been coached by friends to plan something in advance to talk about and even watch them apply this technique. But when I do it, I always feel like I am lying and it's super obvious. Very telltale heart. It's not that I don't want to talk to people, movies, sports, food, politics, pets, etc. Any of these topics? Just prefer to avoid the personal life review, which is somehow what how are things can feel like. End quote. First and foremost, thank you so much for submitting, Anonymous. And I know for a fact that people will relate to this because more than one friend of mine has brought up this anxiety to me. And personally, I used to feel it a ton. Pete, how about you?
Well, I think you know my answer to this. When somebody says, how's things? I always say, crazy, crazy, crazy.
You just scream, I feel like I'm an imposter. And then just run out of the room.
These are just the lessons that I've learned from this show.
Yeah.
I think it's a veritable cornucopia of potential responses to this particular question. I used to have this same problem, and I can't remember what it was that kind of turned me around. I think it was when the first time somebody said, how's things? And I said, pretty crappy.
Oh,
like I just answered honestly, and it all, I realized that the world didn't end. Mm-hmm. And you know what else? The other person said, really? Why? As if they were shocked into answering or into having a conversation.
That's interesting. I mean, that gets into social media. that we've talked about, that everyone is just sort of showing off a hit parade of greatest hits. I mean, instead of actually getting really real about it. Yeah, it seems to just boil down to being to a fear of being judged. More specifically, being judged in comparison to others and or by what we currently are not.
So why is it that you say that this is in the past for you? What's the difference?
Well, I came at it head on. And I figured out, actually, I was taken aback a little bit reading this, reading the submission, because when she or he says, I've been coached by friends to plan something in advance to talk about, that's what I do. I noticed that I was feeling this more and more, especially because compared to a lot of my friends, I don't adult as hard, meaning I'm not married. I don't have kids. I live in an apartment. These things, I was looking down on myself for some of these things in comparison as my friends move into houses, have kids, get married in opposite order. And so what I realized, it came from me trying to be really nice to myself.
Okay.
So do you want to talk about the basics idea first, or just should we go right into what I do practically, what I do to this day?
No, let's talk about the basics first. Give me the intro.
Okay. Well, I found something interesting on a blog called Social Anxiety Shortcuts. And I'm glad that Anonymous did say that they don't seem to suffer from social anxiety, in that they do want to go out and talk to people. It's just about these things. Anyways, this is what I found on the blog. When you fear someone is judging you, what you're really doing is judging yourself and the other person. So let me break that down. Number one, you assume you've done something or are something that is going to cause a negative judgment. That is a reflection of your own fears. But number two, you assume the other person feels the same way about that situation and will also judge you. This is a projection, back to projection, of your own thoughts onto someone else. So You're really doing the work of two people. and it's all based in just your own judgment of yourself.
That's really interesting, because it sort of begs the question, like, who are you talking to? Are you talking to the person who asked the question, really? Or are you just trying to figure out how you're going to talk to yourself?
I think you're really just sort of talking to a mirror, because, I mean, as much as possible, I try to remember that the only one seeing such an unflattering spotlight on me is me.
Right.
And so I try to be kind to myself. And if I'm not going through the best time or feel like I'm not as successful as my other friends, that's okay. Everyone has times like that. And as much as possible, I try and remember that other people's success isn't a comment on me or my overall worth, and that they aren't judging me. Again, it's just really me judging myself. It can be really hard sometimes, but it doesn't need to make social situations hard. Now I can talk about the practicality of what I do.
Yeah.
I can see why saying living the dream or good produces follow-up questions, because there's been nothing specific offered. Specific doesn't have to mean your life story or emotional pitfalls. And this isn't based on research. This is just me talking. So question this. I don't want to accidentally gaslight the internet with this dumb stuff. But what I figured out is that people, the right people, really don't care about my accomplishments. They just want me to be happy and feel a connection during the conversation. How I started dealing with it is when I was catching up, I would have an anecdote ready. Something interesting or funny happens at everyone's job and in everyone's life. So just sort of keep that in your back pocket, because these people aren't looking for my life story just to check in. So if I'm not comfortable giving them a full sum up, I would just tell the anecdote and then pivot the conversation right back to them, because they probably just want to talk about themselves anyway. And so if you can just sort of, for instance, I would tell, if someone said, how's work going? I would tell that story I just told in my regret, and then pivot back to them. How are you?
Yeah.
Then that's fine. Then I don't have to go into the fact that if work is a little light right now, or if I'm having some money troubles, unless I want to share that, there's no need to. I don't feel that that's what people are really looking for. I think it's a connection, something specific, and then a pivot. That's what I do if I'm feeling sort of a little down.
This is where it gets confusing for me, because everything that I have in my head as you're talking about this is somebody who, like, I know, and that, you know, maybe we haven't seen each other in a while. Maybe we see each other at a restaurant or at the bank or something. Who goes to a bank? Go to the bank. Anyway,
soda shop.
Maybe. But what happens when, and this is my experience, when you're like driving through a Starbucks, and sometimes I just want the drink. Just hand me my drink. and you can scan my phone and we can move on with our day. Like, I don't need platitudes, but let's just say my drink is taking a little bit longer to steam or foam or whatever is going on in the workshop.
Yeah.
They'll lean out the window and they'll scan. We'll do our little exchange. And then they'll say, so how's your day? Then what? What
do you do?
What's your natural response? Like, I usually say something like, sun's still shining, like as if the alternative is it's the end of the world. Like,
right.
Well, I'm
still
not
breathing for now.
Exactly.
Such a morbid Starbucks.
That is really morbid, but it's always the first place I go is this like, well, it's either this or we're all dead response, which is terrible.
Well, I say, good, how's yours? Isn't that the social contract?
Man. God.
Wait, do you really?
You just made it sound so easy.
Of course it is. It's the pivot.
You started this anxiety and I thought, no, I got this one under control. And now I'm feeling really terrible.
That was you doing the work of 5 people. Yeah, I mean, just remember that this conversation is for your benefit. Like, you are the one, if someone asks you, it's so they can feel good about your guys' relationship. They can feel good about themselves for asking, and to cover up that horrible silence that is always around us at all times, threatening to break our brains. And so, yeah, for me, I'm not telling Anonymous what to do. I can't tell anyone what to do. I just learned to relax and realize that it's not a angry question. How I choose to let it make me feel is a choice I'm making. And so I chose, and it took a while. And again, I'm doing a little bit of work. Again, I'm saying that I have this story in my back pocket if I need it. But if you're just sort of prepared like that, I think it's fine. And I'm being nice to myself in that I'm believing that it's not obvious of what I'm doing. I remember that's something that Anonymous said, that she or he said that she or he feels it's really obvious if they're lying or just sort of moving the conversation along. I doubt it. I disagree. I don't think people are looking that hard.
Wow. I need practice. Like, how's your day? Well, we're not living in our dystopian Mad Max future yet. Right?
Yeah.
Like,
so you're just driving around bumming everybody out at coffee places?
Call me Happy McDoodle Pants.